When my billionaire boss invited me to a charity gala, he thought he was setting me up for the most humiliating night of my life. He expected me to stand in the corner while his rich friends mocked everything about me. Instead, I walked into that ballroom with a secret that turned his perfect plan into his greatest mistake. By the end of this story, you'll see how one unforgettable night cost him his pride, his reputation, and almost everything he had built. But first, you need to know why I let him underestimate me for so long. The Los Angeles sun never asked for permission when it bled over the Bel Air hills. It spilled through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Xavier Pierce's 20,000-square-foot estate, catching every speck of dust that dared to settle on his imported Italian marble. By 5:30 in the morning, my knees were already aching against the cold, unyielding floor. I had exactly 2 hours to ensure the entire first level looked as though no human being had ever stepped foot in it before the master of the house woke up. My name is Tiana. Most people in this house, however, simply referred to me as, "Excuse me," or "Hey." If they were feeling particularly generous, they called me by my uniform, the dark gray dress with the starched white collar that felt more like a cage than clothing. I dipped my sponge into the bucket of warm water and industrial cleaner, the sharp scent of lemon and ammonia stinging my nostrils. The skin on my hands was dry, cracked at the knuckles, and stripped of all its natural oils. As I wrung out the sponge, I stared at my fingers. These same hands used to sketch avant-garde silhouettes. These same fingers used to drape pure silk organza over dress forms in a studio overlooking downtown. Now they scrubbed the scuff marks left behind by Xavier Pierce's $3,000 designer loafers. I moved systematically across the grand living room, my breathing steady and rhythmic. Invisibility was not just my job, it was my armor. If I was completely invisible, Xavier couldn't find a reason to shout. If I was entirely unnoticeable, I wouldn't become the subject of his morning amusement. I needed this job. The crushing weight of my father's medical debts and the foreclosure notices stacked on my kitchen counter in Crenshaw made sure of that. Pride was a luxury I could no longer afford. By 7 a.m., the massive glass walls overlooking the infinity pool and the sprawling Los Angeles skyline were completely spotless. I stood up, stretching the deep ache out of my lower back, and caught my reflection in the glass. For a fleeting second, I didn't see a maid. I saw the ghost of the woman I used to be, shoulders pulled back, chin lifted, eyes burning with a quiet, undeniable fire. But the illusion shattered the moment I heard the heavy, arrogant thud of footsteps descending the floating glass staircase. Xavier Pierce had arrived. At 28, Xavier was a billionaire tech and media mogul, the golden boy of Silicon Beach. He was tall, impeccably groomed, and moved with the casual entitlement of a man who had never been told no in his entire life. He wore a crisp, dark linen shirt, unbuttoned perfectly at the collar, and tailored trousers that probably cost more than my monthly rent. "Is the coffee ready, or are we just staring at the windows today?" His voice sliced through the quiet morning air, cold and dripping with condescension. I immediately lowered my gaze, snapping my hands behind my back. "The coffee is ready, Mr. Pierce. Freshly brewed Colombian roast exactly as you requested." He didn't even look at me. He walked past me as if I were a piece of furniture, dragging his finger along the edge of the granite kitchen island. He inspected his fingertip for dust. Finding none, he let out a disappointed exhale, as if he had been robbed of the opportunity to reprimand me. "Pour it," he commanded, sitting down on one of the plush velvet bar stools and picking up his phone. I hurried to the kitchen, my rubber-soled shoes silent against the marble. I poured the dark liquid into his favorite matte black ceramic mug, measuring exactly 1 teaspoon of raw sugar and a splash of oat milk. I placed it quietly next to his hand. "Your friends will be arriving at 8:30 a.m. for breakfast, sir. The chef is currently preparing the truffle omelettes and smoked salmon," I informed him, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. Xavier took a sip of the coffee, his eyes never leaving his phone screen. "Make sure you stay out of sight when they get here unless you're serving. Julian is bringing his new investors. I don't need you hovering around looking depressed and ruining the aesthetic." "Yes, sir," I whispered, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. At exactly 8:30 a.m., the tranquil silence of the estate was violently ruptured by the roar of high-performance engines echoing up the driveway. A matte black G-Wagon and a sleek, cherry-red Ferrari pulled up to the front entrance. Xavier's inner circle had arrived. I stood by the kitchen corridor, holding a silver tray with crystal glasses of freshly squeezed orange juice, waiting for my cue. Julian, a venture capitalist with a loud laugh and an ego the size of the Hollywood sign, strutted through the double doors. He was followed by Chloe, an heiress and socialite whose entire personality revolved around her inherited wealth and her massive social media following. And Marcus, a real estate developer who spoke exclusively in buzzwords. "Xavier, my man!" Julian boomed, pulling Xavier into a half hug. "This place looks better every time I come up here. The view is insane." "It's decent," Xavier smirked, leading them toward the sprawling outdoor terrace where the breakfast table had been set. "Keeps me above the smog." Chloe tossed her designer handbag onto a custom suede armchair, completely ignoring the fact that the bag's heavy metal hardware could scratch the fabric. She ran a hand through her perfectly styled, voluminous extensions. "Honestly, I don't know how you deal with the drive up here. It's so far from everything that matters." "That's the point, Chloe. It keeps the peasants away." Xavier laughed, gesturing for them to sit. I waited a beat before stepping out onto the terrace, my face a mask of absolute submission. I walked smoothly, balancing the heavy silver tray, and began placing the crystal glasses down beside their plates. The morning air was warm, smelling of eucalyptus and the faint, salty breeze from the Pacific Ocean, but the atmosphere at the table was suffocating. "Oh, careful!" Chloe shrieked suddenly, pulling her arm back as I placed her glass down. I hadn't even touched her, but she glared at me as if I had just attempted to poison her. "Watch what you're doing. This blouse is vintage silk. If you spill anything on it, your entire year's salary won't cover the dry cleaning." I stopped. I didn't apologize, but I bowed my head slightly. "I assure you nothing spilled, ma'am." Julian barked out a laugh, cutting into his truffle omelet. "Look at her, Where do you find these people? They're like little robots. Does she even smile?" Xavier leaned back in his chair, swirling his orange juice and looking at me as if I were an exhibit at a zoo. "Tiana doesn't have much to smile about, Julian. She's just happy to be in the presence of success. Aren't you, Tiana?" My jaw locked so tightly. My teeth ached. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to drop the tray, to look Xavier square in his arrogant eyes and tell him exactly what I thought of his cheap, unearned superiority. I wanted to tell Chloe that her vintage silk blouse was actually a poorly constructed knockoff from a mid-tier collection 3 seasons ago. I would know. I had studied the designer's authentic stitching, but I swallowed the fire in my throat. I thought of the red numbers in my bank account. I thought of my mother's quiet, tired voice on the phone the night before. "Yes, Mr. Pierce," I said, my voice eerily calm, empty of any emotion they could use against me. "See?" Xavier grinned, turning back to his friends. "Completely trained. It's all about how you manage them. You just have to remind them of their place." "Brilliant," Marcus chimed in, chewing loudly. "Hey, speaking of managing things, are we all set for the Malibu Charity Gala next week? I heard half of Forbes' top 100 is going to be there." Chloe clapped her hands together, her diamond rings flashing in the sunlight. "It is going to be the event of the season. I've already secured a custom gown from Paris. It's absolutely to die for. We are going to own that red carpet." Xavier nodded, taking a bite of his food. "The gala is going to be massive. I'm hosting the after-party at the beach house. We need to make sure the press gets the right angles." He paused, his eyes lazily drifting back to me as I stood silently in the corner of the terrace. A slow, cruel smile crept across his face. It was the smile of a predator that had just spotted a wounded animal. "You know," Xavier started, his voice dropping into a theatrical whisper that was still loud enough for me to hear clearly, "the gala is going to be incredibly stuffy. Lots of old money, lots of boring speeches. We need some entertainment." Julian looked confused. "What do you mean? They hired that Grammy-winning string quartet, didn't they?" No, Xavier chuckled darkly, leaning in. "I mean real entertainment. Something hilarious. A contrast to remind everyone how good we have it." He turned in his seat and pointed directly at me. "Tiana." I stiffened, keeping my eyes fixed on the distant skyline. "Yes, sir." I walked over slowly, my hands clasped tightly in front of me. The 4 of them stared at me. Chloe was already smirking, sensing the cruelty that was about to unfold. "We are going to a very important charity gala next Saturday in Malibu," Xavier announced, looking me up and down with intense disgust. And I think it would be a fantastic learning experience for you to see how the other half lives. You're officially invited as my personal guest. The table erupted. Julian slapped the glass table so hard his silverware rattled. Bro, are you serious? You're going to bring the maid to the black tie Malibu Gala? Chloe threw her head back, laughing so hard she had to hold her stomach. Oh my God, Xavier, you are sick. What is she going to wear? The apron? Wait, do you even own anything that isn't polyester? She looked at me, her eyes wide with fake pity. Please tell me you don't plan on wearing those awful rubber shoes on the red carpet. They'll never let you pass the gates. Marcus was shaking his head, highly amused. The paparazzi are going to have a field day. Tech billionaire Xavier Pierce shows his philanthropic side by adopting a local maid for the night. It's brilliant PR, actually. They talked about me as if I were deaf, as if I were a piece of clay they could mold into a joke. The humiliation burned in the center of my chest, hot and suffocating. Xavier watched my face intently, looking for a crack. He wanted me to cry. He wanted me to beg him not to make me go. He wanted the absolute power of seeing me break down in front of his friends, admitting that I didn't belong in their world. I looked at Chloe's mocking face. I looked at Julian's cruel grin, and finally I looked directly into Xavier Pierce's eyes. I didn't cry. I didn't tremble. I simply adjusted my posture, pulling my shoulders back, instantly adding an inch to my height. I let a long, heavy silence fall over the terrace. The laughter slowly died down as my unnatural calm began to make them uncomfortable. I didn't look like a maid in that split second. I looked like someone assessing a room full of children. Thank you for the invitation, Mr. Pierce, I said, my voice smooth, cold, and completely steady. I wouldn't miss it for the world. Xavier's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. It wasn't the reaction he wanted. He narrowed his eyes, clearly annoyed by my lack of panic. Just make sure you don't embarrass me. Try to find something decent in a thrift store and stay out of the photos. I will dress exactly as the occasion requires, sir, I replied, bowing my head once more before turning on my heel and walking back into the mansion. As I walked away, I heard Julian mutter, Man, she's weird. Did you see the way she just stared at you? Whatever. Xavier brushed it off. It's going to be hilarious. I can't wait to see her standing in a corner looking like a lost dog. I walked through the long, echoing halls of the glass mansion, heading straight for the laundry room. I closed the heavy wooden door behind me and locked it. The moment the lock clicked, I let out a long, shaky breath, leaning my forehead against the cool metal of the industrial washing machine. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. They thought they knew exactly who I was. They thought they had me perfectly categorized in their shallow, gilded world. A poor, uneducated maid from Crenshaw who should be grateful just to breathe the same purified Bel Air air as them. I pushed myself off the washing machine and looked up at the small mirror above the utility sink. My eyes were dark and fiercely determined. Xavier Pierce wanted a joke. He wanted entertainment. He wanted to use me as a prop to elevate his own fragile ego in front of Los Angeles high society. You want a show, Xavier? I whispered to my reflection in the quiet, sterile room. A slow, genuine smile finally touched my lips, sharp and dangerous. I'll give you a show you'll never forget. The rest of my shift inside the Pierce estate was a masterclass in dissociation. After the breakfast dishes were cleared, I spent 3 hours polishing the grand piano in the foyer, a magnificent Steinway that Xavier didn't even know how to play. He kept it purely for the aesthetic, a hollow symbol of culture in a house devoid of any real soul. I buffed the black lacquer until it mirrored the massive crystal chandelier above it, my mind entirely detached from the physical ache in my shoulders. By the time the grandfather clock in the study struck 6 in the evening, my uniform was clinging to my skin, heavy with the sweat of an invisible laborer. I clocked out on the digital tablet in the staff kitchen, stripped off the dark gray dress with the stifling white collar, and changed back into my own clothes. A faded pair of denim jeans and an oversized black hoodie that swallowed my frame. Leaving the Bel Air estate always felt like crossing the border between 2 different planets. The security gates, wrought iron and tipped with gold, swung open silently to let me out, immediately locking behind me. Because the city buses didn't service the ultra-exclusive enclaves of the hills, I had to walk 1.5 miles down the steep, winding roads just to reach the nearest transit stop on Sunset Boulevard. The Los Angeles sun was beginning its descent, casting a hazy golden-pink glow over the Pacific Ocean in the distance. The air up here smelled of jasmine, manicured pine, and expensive irrigation. But as the bus finally arrived and carried me eastward, down the 405 freeway and deep into the heart of the city, the air changed. The scent of jasmine was replaced by the smell of exhaust, hot asphalt, and the savory smoke from street-side taco stands. The sprawling glass mansions faded into cramped apartment complexes with barred windows and peeling paint. When I finally stepped off the bus in Crenshaw, the neon signs of the local liquor stores and laundromats were flickering to life against the twilight. This was my reality. This was the world Xavier Pierce and his friends found so repulsive, yet it possessed 10 times the warmth and authenticity of their sterile, multi-million-dollar echo chambers. I walked the 3 blocks to my apartment building, a low-rise brick structure that had seen better decades. The staircase groaned under my weight as I climbed to the 3rd floor. I unlocked my door with a heavy sigh, the familiar scent of lemon pine sol and old wood greeting me. My apartment was small, just a living room that doubled as a kitchen, a tiny bathroom, and a bedroom barely large enough to fit a full-sized mattress. But it was meticulously clean. Everything had its place. I dropped my keys into the ceramic bowl by the door and immediately saw them. The stack of envelopes on the kitchen counter. They were impossible to ignore. 2 of them bore the aggressive red stamping of Final Notice, while the others featured the cold, sterile logos of the Los Angeles County Medical Center. I didn't need to open them to know what they said. I had memorized the numbers. $42,865. I walked over, resting my fingertips against the top envelope. My chest tightened, the familiar, crushing weight of debt pressing down on my lungs. Beside the stack of bills sat a framed photograph. It was a picture of my father and me, taken 5 years ago in front of his tailor shop in Leimert Park. In the photo, I was 22, my hair braided in long, elegant locks, my eyes bright and overflowing with naive ambition. My father was smiling, his arm wrapped proudly around my shoulders, an old measuring tape draped around his neck like a medal of honor. He was a master tailor, a man who could look at a piece of raw fabric and tell you exactly how it would drape over a human body. He taught me everything I knew. He taught me the difference between French seams and flat felled seams. He taught me how to cut fabric on the bias so it would move like liquid. Because of him, I earned a full-ride scholarship to one of the most prestigious fashion and design institutes in New York City. I was at the top of my class. I was interning for a legendary fashion house, spending my nights draping silk and my days breathing in the chaotic electric energy of the garment district. I was on the verge of launching my own capsule collection. I was so close I could taste it. And then the phone call came. A severe stroke. Heart complications, a mountain of medical interventions that his modest insurance refused to cover. The tailor shop had to be sold. The hospital bills piled up faster than I could comprehend. I didn't hesitate. I dropped out of my program, packed my bags, and flew back to Los Angeles to take care of him. I traded my sketchbooks for scrub brushes, my design studio for the sprawling mansions of the Hollywood elite, because cleaning houses paid in cash immediately and allowed me to work the grueling hours necessary to keep the debt collectors at bay. My father passed away 2 years ago, but the debt he left behind did not. It anchored me to this life. It chained me to people like Xavier Pierce, forcing me to swallow my pride and my voice just to keep the lights on and the creditors from garnishing what little I had left. I traced the edge of the photograph with my thumb. "He invited me to a gala, Dad," I whispered to the empty room, a bitter, hollow laugh escaping my lips. "To make fun of me, to show his friends what a real peasant looks like." I closed my eyes, the memory of Chloe's shrill laughter and Xavier's predatory grin flashing in my mind. They thought I was nothing. They thought my entire existence was defined by the gray uniform I wore and the sponge I held in my cracked hands. They believed that because I scrubbed their floors, I lacked the capacity for grace, for elegance, for power. My eyes snapped open. The sadness evaporated, replaced by a cold, burning resolve. I walked past the kitchen and into my cramped bedroom. I pushed my small mattress to the side, exposing the scuffed hardwood floor beneath the bed frame. Dropping to my knees, I reached into the deep, dark space near the wall and grasped the heavy leather handle of my father's old vintage trunk. It took all my strength to drag it out. The trunk was massive, covered in distressed, dark brown leather, with heavy brass clasps that had oxidized into a dull green over the years. It was heavy with the weight of my past, a time capsule of the woman I had forced myself to forget so I could survive the present. I sat on the floor, the rough wood digging into my knees, and stared at the brass locks. For 3 years I had refused to open this trunk. Opening it meant facing the ghost of my former self. It meant acknowledging the massive gaping hole in my chest where my dreams used to live. But tonight, the ghost was exactly who I needed. I flipped the brass clasps. They snapped open with a sharp, metallic clack that echoed in the quiet apartment. I pushed the heavy lid back. The scent of cedar wood, old parchment, and expensive textiles wafted up, hitting my senses like a physical blow. Tears pricked the corners of my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. The top layer of the trunk was filled with my old sketchbooks. Dozens of them bound in black moleskin, every page filled with charcoal lines, fabric swatches, and furious, brilliant notes on structural design. Beneath the sketchbooks lay my portfolio, containing photographs of the garments I had built by hand in New York. I carefully lifted the books in the portfolio, setting them gently on the floor beside me. Beneath them, wrapped meticulously in layers of acid-free archival tissue paper, was the masterpiece. My hands trembled slightly as I peeled back the delicate tissue. The fabric caught the dim yellow light of my bedroom lamp and seemed to ignite. It was a gown, but calling it a gown felt like a severe understatement. It was a weapon. I had designed and constructed this piece for my final presentation in New York, just weeks before I got the call about my father. I poured over 300 hours of labor into this single garment. I lifted it from the trunk. The fabric was a heavy, liquid silk charmeuse in a color so deep it defied a simple description. It wasn't just red. It was the color of a bruised rose, a dark, dangerous crimson that shifted into the color of freshly spilled wine, depending on how the light struck it. I stood up, holding the gown against my body, and looked in the cracked, full-length mirror attached to my closet door. The design was an architectural marvel, entirely avant-garde yet dripping with classic Hollywood glamour. It featured an asymmetrical bodice with exposed, structured corsetry that I had built by hand, bone by bone, mimicking the ribcage. The silk draped across the torso in sharp, precise folds, cinching violently at the waist before cascading down into a floor-sweeping skirt. The skirt itself was a masterpiece of bias cutting, designed to cling to the hips and flow like heavy water with every single step. But the true magic lay in the back, a plunging, open cowl drape that fell into a sweeping, dramatic train, lined underneath with hundreds of tiny hand-sewn obsidian beads that gave the hem a weighted, magnetic sway. It was a dress meant for a queen. It was a dress meant to command a room, to silence a crowd, to demand absolute reverence. "You want me to find something decent in a thrift store, Xavier?" I murmured to my reflection, the deep crimson silk glowing violently against my rich dark skin. "You want me to remind everyone how good you have it?" A fierce, unforgiving energy surged through my veins. The quiet, submissive maid who stared at the floor and apologized for breathing was gone. She had been left behind in the laundry room of the Bel-Air mansion. I laid the gown carefully across my bed and walked over to my closet. I reached up to the top shelf and pulled down a heavy, dust-covered carrying case. I unzipped it to reveal my father's vintage Singer heavy-duty sewing machine. The cold, black metal of the machine felt like an old friend greeting my hands. I set the machine up on my small kitchen table, plugging it into the wall. It hummed to life with a low, steady vibration that resonated through the floorboards. I opened my sewing kit, a beautiful mahogany box my father had carved for me, and pulled out my shears, a box of silk pins, and a spool of crimson thread that perfectly matched the gown. The dress had been tailored to my body 3 years ago, but the grueling manual labor of scrubbing floors and carrying heavy buckets had changed my physique. My shoulders were broader now, my arms more defined, my waist slightly narrower from the physical toll of my work. The gown needed to fit not just perfectly but flawlessly. It needed to look as though it had been painted onto my skin. I stripped down to my undergarments and slipped the heavy silk over my head. The cold fabric slid down my body, sending a shiver down my spine. I stood in front of the mirror, a fistful of silk pins in my mouth, and went to work. My hands moved with a muscle memory that defied the years of inactivity. My fingers, though calloused and dry, manipulated the delicate silk with the precision of a surgeon. I pinned the waist tighter, accentuating the dramatic curve of my hips. I adjusted the boning in the corset, ensuring the bodice lifted and supported without suffocating. I draped the asymmetrical shoulder, pinning the fabric so it would frame my collarbone like a piece of dark art. For the next 6 hours, the only sound in my apartment was the rhythmic, aggressive clack, clack, clack of the sewing machine needle piercing the fabric. I lost myself in the rhythm. The anxiety of my debt, the humiliation of the morning breakfast, the sheer cruelty of Xavier Pierce, it all fueled the pedal beneath my foot. Every stitch was a reclamation of my dignity. Every seam I reinforced was a boundary I was drawing between myself and the world that sought to break me. When my eyes grew heavy and the numbers on the microwave clock read 3 a.m., I brewed a pot of cheap coffee, drank it black, and went back to the machine. I unstitched the hemline and shortened it by exactly half an inch, ensuring it would hover perfectly over a pair of vintage black velvet stiletto pumps I had wrapped in felt at the bottom of the trunk. By the time the sun began to peek through the blinds of my Crenshaw apartment, casting a pale gray light over my living room, the gown was finished. I hung it on a padded velvet hanger and hooked it to the top of the doorframe. I took a step back, the exhaustion in my bones entirely masked by the sheer adrenaline pumping through my heart. The dress was a lethal weapon. It was flawless. The structural integrity of the corset was impeccable, and the liquid silk fell with a heavy, dramatic grace that mass-produced designer labels could only dream of achieving. I walked into the bathroom and turned on the shower, letting the hot water wash away the sweat and the lingering smell of the industrial cleaners from the mansion. I scrubbed my skin until it was raw, washing away the maid, washing away the submission, washing away the girl who stared at the marble floors. When I stepped out, I wrapped a towel around my hair and walked back to the kitchen counter. I picked up one of the red stamped medical bills. I didn't look at the number this time. I just looked at my name printed on the envelope. Xavier Pierce didn't know my last name. Chloe didn't know my last name. To them, I was just a first name, a uniform, a prop in their shallow, narcissistic play. They had invited a stereotype to their Malibu gala. They had invited a punchline. I looked up from the envelope and stared at the deep crimson gown hanging in the morning light. They were expecting a mouse to walk into a den of lions, but they had absolutely no idea that they had just invited a dragon to the feast. And by the time the night was over, I was going to burn their entire social hierarchy to the ground. Saturday evening arrived with the kind of golden, cinematic twilight that Los Angeles was famous for, casting a warm, honeyed glow over the concrete grid of the city. Inside my Crenshaw apartment, however, the atmosphere was icy, calculated, and sharp. I stood in front of my small bathroom mirror, gripping the edges of the porcelain sink. The woman staring back at me was a stranger to the Pierce estate, but she was deeply, intimately familiar to me. I had spent the last 2 hours meticulously constructing my armor. My skin, a rich, deep mahogany, glowed flawlessly. I had bypassed the heavy, cakey makeup trends that Chloe and her socialite friends favored, opting instead for a luminous, skin-focused finish that highlighted my natural bone structure. With a steady hand, I applied a sharp, winged eyeliner that elongated my eyes, giving them a predatory, feline intensity. Finally, I swiped on a deep, matte berry lipstick, a shade so dark it bordered on black, perfectly mirroring the bruised rose crimson of the gown. My hair, usually tied back in a rushed utilitarian bun for scrubbing floors, was now an architectural masterpiece. I had spent the morning parting and slicking my thick texture into a sleek, structural, braided updo that sat high on my crown, pulling my features tight and elongating my neck. It was regal. It was uncompromising. It was the kind of hair that demanded you look at the face beneath it. I walked into the bedroom and stepped into the vintage black velvet stilettos. They were 4-inch, razor-thin spikes that forced my posture into absolute alignment. Then I reached for the gown. The heavy silk charmeuse slid over my skin like liquid fire. The moment the zipper locked into place at the small of my back, a physical transformation took over my body. The internal corset I had rebuilt hugged my ribcage, forcing my shoulders back and my chin up. The asymmetrical draping over my collarbone felt like a shield, and the sweeping train, weighted with hundreds of tiny obsidian beads, pulled around my feet with a heavy magnetic pull. I looked in the full-length mirror. The maid was dead. The girl who apologized for breathing, who kept her eyes glued to the Italian marble floors, who swallowed her pride to keep a billionaire comfortable. She was gone, buried under 3 years of silence. In her place stood a high-fashion architect, a runway veteran, a woman who knew exactly how to wield beauty as a weapon. I reached for my phone and opened my banking app. My checking account balance sat at a dismal $312. The money was meant for groceries, electricity, and a partial payment on the medical debt. Without hesitation, I opened a rideshare app, selected the ultra-premium black SUV option, and booked a ride to the exclusive Malibu coastline. It cost me $180. You do not ride a pumpkin to a ball when you plan on burning the castle down. When the sleek, tinted Cadillac Escalade pulled up to the curb outside my brick apartment building, the driver, an older gentleman in a sharp suit, stepped out to open the door for me. He took one look at me, his eyes widening in visible shock, and quickly adjusted his tie. "Good evening, ma'am," he said, his voice laced with instant, unprompted respect. "Good evening," I replied, my voice smooth and low. I gathered the heavy silk of my skirt and stepped into the plush leather interior of the SUV. The drive up the Pacific Coast Highway was a blur of crashing dark waves and salty ocean air. As we left the congested city streets behind and wound our way up the coastal cliffs toward Malibu, the traffic thickened with a parade of luxury vehicles. Rolls-Royces, Maybachs, Bentleys, and custom Ferraris crawled along the cliffside road, all funneling toward the same destination, a sprawling, ultra-modern glass and steel fortress perched on a bluff overlooking the Pacific Ocean. This was the zenith of African-American high society in Los Angeles. This was where the titans of tech, entertainment, and real estate gathered to flaunt their wealth under the guise of philanthropy. As my SUV inched closer to the grand entrance, the glow of the event became blinding. Massive spotlights swept across the night sky. A sprawling red carpet rolled down the expansive circular driveway, flanked on both sides by velvet ropes. Behind those ropes stood a literal army of paparazzi, their camera flashes exploding like strobe lights in a nightclub. The air vibrated with the heavy bass of a string quartet playing a modern hip-hop arrangement over hidden speakers, mixed with the shouting of photographers desperate for a good angle. I sat in the back of the Escalade, the tinted windows shielding me from the chaos outside. My heart was completely, unnervingly calm. The rhythmic beating in my chest was the slow, steady drum of a runway countdown. Through the windshield I saw them. Standing right at the apex of the red carpet near the grand glass doors of the estate was Xavier Pierce. He was holding court. He wore a custom midnight blue velvet tuxedo jacket with a black silk lapel, looking every bit the arrogant tech billionaire he was. Flanking him were Julian, Marcus, and Chloe. Chloe was practically vibrating with self-importance, wearing the custom Paris gown she had bragged about. I took one look at it through the glass and mentally dissected it. It was a chaotic mess of excessive tulle and cheap rhinestones, completely lacking any structural integrity. It swallowed her figure, making her look less like a socialite and more like a frosted cupcake. They were sipping champagne from crystal flutes, laughing loudly and deliberately lingering near the entrance. I knew exactly what they were doing. They were waiting. They were positioning themselves at the front door to ensure they didn't miss my arrival. They wanted to see the poorly dressed maid stumble out of an Uber, blinded by the cameras, terrified and out of place, so they could have their joke before the gala even began. Xavier kept glancing down the driveway, a cruel, expectant smirk playing on his lips. He was ready for his entertainment. My SUV pulled to a smooth stop directly at the start of the red carpet. The driver put the car in park and quickly got out, rushing around the hood to open my door. The moment the heavy door swung open, the scent of the ocean hit me, mixed with the expensive colognes of the elite, and the ozone smell of flashing cameras. A few paparazzi, assuming I was just a +1 to a C-list producer based on the rented SUV, aimed their lenses lazily in my direction. I placed my vintage black velvet stiletto onto the red carpet. Then I rose. I didn't step out of the car, I ascended from it. I pulled my shoulders back, engaging my core, and stepped fully into the blinding lights. The deep crimson silk charmeuse caught the aggressive flashing of the cameras and ignited. The fabric seemed to glow from within, the heavy bias-cut folds wrapping around my hips like water before cascading down the stairs. The hand-sewn obsidian beads at the hem caught the light, sparkling like shattered glass in the dark. For 2 full seconds there was absolute ringing silence from the photographers immediately in front of me. The shouting died. The lazy clicking of cameras stopped. Then chaos erupted. "Who is that? Over here! Look over here! Ma'am, to your left! Over your shoulder! Who are you wearing? Look right here! Beautiful!" The paparazzi went feral. The flashes became a continuous blinding wall of white light. They didn't know who I was, but in Los Angeles, you didn't need to know someone's name to recognize raw, undeniable power. They recognized the cut of the fabric. They recognized the astronomical level of tailoring. And most importantly, they recognized the posture. I didn't smile. I didn't wave. I didn't look at the cameras. I locked my eyes dead ahead, focusing entirely on the glass doors at the end of the carpet, and I began to walk. My runway walk was a muscle memory carved into my bones. 1 foot directly in front of the other, an invisible straight line, the hips swaying with a controlled rhythmic fluidity. The heavy train of the gown followed me like a dark storm, the obsidian beads giving the fabric a weighted, mesmerizing sway that made it look as though I were gliding rather than walking. The red carpet, crowded with actors, executives, and minor celebrities, naturally began to part. People physically stepped aside to let me through. Women in designer dresses stopped mid-conversation, their mouths falling open as they took in the architectural genius of the bodice. Men lowered their champagne glasses, staring in unfiltered awe. I was a ghost of a high-fashion past, resurrected and armed for war. 70 feet away at the top of the carpet, the laughter died in Xavier Pierce's throat. Through the sea of flashing lights and parting bodies, his eyes locked onto mine. The transformation on his face was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. First, it was confusion. He saw the crowd parting for a woman in a breathtaking crimson gown, assuming it was an A-list actress or an international supermodel making a late entrance. He squinted, trying to place the face. Then, as I closed the distance, the recognition hit him. The smug, arrogant smirk melted off his face like wax held to a flame. His eyes widened to a comical degree, his pupils dilating in sheer, unadulterated shock. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. The crystal champagne flute in his hand tilted precariously, the expensive liquid dangerously close to spilling onto his velvet shoes. Chloe's reaction was even more violent. She stepped forward, her eyes darting from my face to the gown, then back to my face. The color completely drained from her makeup-heavy cheeks. She looked like she had just been physically struck. Her custom Paris gown suddenly looked exactly like what it was, a cheap, loud costume next to a piece of true couture art. Julian and Marcus were frozen. Julian's jaw was literally hanging open, his eyes raking over the flawless fit of the silk against my waist, the sharp, elegant structure of my braided updo, and the cold, feline intensity in my eyes. I didn't slow my pace. I didn't break my stride. I walked directly up to their small, exclusive circle, the heavy obsidian train sweeping across the carpet behind me. I stopped exactly 3 feet in front of Xavier. The paparazzi at the entrance were screaming my direction, their flashes illuminating the absolute devastation on Xavier's face. I stood tall, the 4-inch stilettos bringing my eyes nearly level with his. I let the silence stretch. I let him drown in it. I let him feel the crushing weight of the power dynamic flipping so fast it gave him whiplash. "Good evening, Mr. Pierce," I said. My voice was smooth, quiet, and laced with ice, cutting perfectly through the noise of the cameras. "I hope I'm not underdressed for the occasion. Thrift stores in Crenshaw can be so terribly unpredictable." Xavier blinked, his chest rising and falling rapidly. He looked at my face, then down to the impossibly intricate corsetry of the bodice, then back to my eyes. His brain was short-circuiting. The world he had built, the world where he was the untouchable king and I was the invisible, pathetic peasant, was collapsing around him in real time. "Tiana?" Julian whispered, his voice cracking. He looked at me as if I were a hallucination. "Is that Is that you? I didn't look at Julian. I kept my eyes locked on Xavier, watching the panic begin to set in behind his eyes. What? Xavier started, his voice a hoarse, weak rasp. He cleared his throat, trying desperately to regain some fraction of his authority. What are you wearing? How did you get this? I brought a guest, Xavier, Chloe suddenly hissed, stepping forward. Her voice was shrill, trembling with deep insecurity and rage. Who did you steal this from? That is a couture piece. You scrub floors. I finally turned my gaze to Chloe. I looked her up and down, taking in the chaotic tulle and the cheap rhinestones. I didn't look angry. I looked profoundly bored. A flat felled seam on a tulle overlay is a terrible choice for your body type, Chloe, I said calmly, my voice loud enough for the people standing nearby to hear. It adds unnecessary bulk to the waistline, and the rhinestones are glued, not hand-set. If you paid more than $1,000 for that dress, your stylist robbed you. Chloe gasped, stepping back as if I had thrown acid on her. She looked down at her dress, her hands flying to her waist in horror. Several people in the crowd who had overheard let out low, audible chuckles. I turned back to Xavier, who was still staring at me in paralyzed shock. Excuse me, I said smoothly, stepping around him. I didn't wait for him to respond. I didn't wait for his permission. I simply walked past him, the heavy silk train of my gown brushing against his expensive velvet trousers as I moved toward the grand glass doors of the Gala. As I crossed the threshold into the massive, glittering ballroom, the energy of the entire event shifted. The room was a breathtaking display of wealth, featuring towering crystal centerpieces, walls draped in white silk, and hundreds of Los Angeles's most powerful African-American elites mingling with champagne. But the moment I stepped inside, the conversations near the door abruptly stopped. The silence rippled outward like a wave. Heads turned. Glasses were lowered. The string quartet playing on a raised platform in the center of the room seemed to falter for half a beat as the cellist caught sight of the gown. I walked into the center of the room, moving with the slow, deliberate grace of a woman who owned the very air she breathed. I could hear the whispers starting, hot and frantic, echoing off the high ceilings. My God, who is that? Is she a model? Look at that walk. That dress. That has to be an archive piece. It's flawless. I've never seen her in LA before. Who did she come with? I walked toward a high-top table near the edge of the dance floor, completely unbothered by the hundreds of eyes tracking my every move. A waiter in a crisp, white tuxedo jacket rushed over to me immediately, offering a silver tray with crystal glasses of champagne. He bowed his head slightly, treating me with a level of deference I hadn't experienced in years. Champagne, ma'am? He asked softly. Thank you, I said, lifting the delicate flute from the tray. I turned back toward the entrance, taking a slow sip of the cold, crisp champagne. Xavier Pierce had finally unfrozen. He was marching through the glass doors, his face flushed with a mixture of intense embarrassment and desperate anger. Julian, Marcus, and a deeply humiliated Chloe followed closely behind him. Xavier looked around the room. He saw the billionaires, the movie stars, and the media executives, the people whose approval he worshipped, all staring at me in absolute reverence. The joke he had meticulously planned had backfired with catastrophic precision. He had brought a maid to mock her, and instead he had just introduced the entire room to its new queen. He locked eyes with me across the room. He was furious. He was panicked. He was realizing that he had absolutely no control over the situation. I held his gaze, raised my champagne glass slightly in his direction, and allowed a slow, razor-sharp smile to finally cross my lips. The night had only just begun.